Continuing thread on this morning's edition of the Elias Macko Show is money. And we're going to begin this third hour of the show talking about a nasty shock that could be in store for Canadian homeowners. And it's those homeowners that are renewing their mortgages that could face that biggest shock. New analysis shows that higher interest rates will begin to increase pressure on some 2.2 million Canadian mortgage holders facing higher interest rates. It will put financial pressure on the borrowers. And that financial pressure has only increased as we are seeing the proportion of mortgages that are in arrears increase significantly, especially on those of $400,000, mortgages of $400,000 and up. With more on this, let's go to Phillip Colmar, Global Strategist at MRB Partners. Phillip, welcome back to the program.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And I want to say, I know you joined us, I don't know, a month or so ago or 2 months ago, and I really enjoyed that discussion. So I'm happy that you're back on. Let's talk about this brewing debacle, this brewing shock for homeowners. What are we talking about here when it comes to Canadian homeowners and what they can expect over the next little while?
Yeah, it's a real problem. We've had a massive normalization in mortgage rates over the past 18 months. And unfortunately, Canadians, unlike south of the border, they don't get to lock in for 30 years. And so this is a real issue. The Bank of Canada already estimates by the end of this year, something like 47% of those mortgages will be reset at decisively higher mortgage rates. But then because the most that you can really borrow out is 5 years, and it's an 18-month story, 2-year story already underway, it's really in the next 2 years to 3 years, you're going to have the residual of that. So really 100% are going to reset to much higher mortgage rates. And that's already brewing to be a major problem. If you look at the amount of homeowners just unable to, once reset to higher interest rates, they're not covering any principal anymore. They're not even covering all of the interest on those debts. Like if you look at the Canadian banks, you can really see it on theirs, their last earnings releases, even if you just take, BMO, CIBC, and TD, they're pretty transparent in their releases on that. And they're showing something like 20% or a negative amortization. So negative amortization means when they can't cover the interest, let alone pay the interest or pay the principal at this point. So that's with 40-some% being rolled over. This shock is coming. If mortgage rates don't fall, time's not working for this market.
Okay.
That's the problem.
So let's look at this. Let's say mortgage rates don't drop. They stay in this ballpark.
Yeah.
Then what? What will be the ramifications when 2.2 million Canadians have to renew?
Well, unfortunately, it's pretty ugly because, a lot of people have been banking, and certainly the financial institutions, that the mortgage rates would drop, but there's a good chance they won't. And so, as you said, what you're going to end up with is a huge amount of homeowners that had gotten too stretched over the skis, if you will, in terms of debt levels, and now it's coming home to roost, and which means that in order to make those payments, it's soaking up pretty much all of their discretionary income, and more so because they're barely paying these interests, or an increasing number of them aren't. And so what happens is they don't have spending power left. They don't have the income to consume, and that's really, the economy is already looking fairly fragile, and that's where you start to see consumption really weaken. And that's where you brew a housing downturn, unfortunately, much like you saw in the United States or Eurozone back after 2008. So it's not a great outcome for housing. It's not a great outcome for the economy. It's a real problem.
So, I hear people say, well, you know what, the interest rates are going to come down. The Bank of Canada just can't keep them that high for that long. So what do you say to someone who says, who's convinced, well, the Bank of Canada next year, they're going to start lowering rates? Make the case that won't happen.
Well, I think there's twofold. There's the long-term rates, which is people have bond yields or mortgage rates linked to 5-year rolling. The Bank of Canada doesn't really have any control, or very little control, over the 5-year mortgage rate. That's really driven south of the border and on global forces. So the reason why the mortgage rate's higher is really because the U.S. is in resilient shape, unlike Canada, which is looking pretty fragile right now. Now, the offset is that the Bank of Canada, which has been fixated on inflation, and I think wrongfully so, I've taken shots at it, it's dealing with a major housing issue. It could cut rates preemptively and bring down interest rates, and then everybody who gets refinanced gets refinanced at short-term floating. So it's basically bails out the system, but at short-term floating. There's some consequences to that. One is the currency weakens significantly because they're cutting rates when the Fed or the Federal Reserve south of the border isn't. And so you would get another wave. Canada imports a lot of what it consumes. You get more inflation. So it's not a free lunch. but it may be the only solution ultimately when housing starts to crack is to drop the short-term rates and try to refinance everybody at short-term floating. Of course, you'd have to keep it low for a long time to keep those people afloat, if you will.
We're with Phillip Colmar, global strategist at MRB Partners. Phillip, I have a question for you. You referenced just how resilient, robust the U.S. economy is. How do you explain how the U.S. keeps on humming along and how Canada is in stagnation at best?
Yeah, the real difference is the U.S. went through its housing crisis following the 2008 downturn. And since then, what happened is households got they brought down their debt levels substantially. So they pulled back their consumption behavior for 10 or 15 years, and their debt to income levels are quite low. So as interest rates rise, when you don't have that much debt, it doesn't bite the same way. You're able to consume. At the same time, during the pandemic, there was a lot of fiscal transfers. So the household sector has this excess pool of wealth or savings, if you will, that is providing support. So the household balance sheet in the United States looks really good. Unfortunately, in Canada, we took those very low interest rates for that 10 or 15-year period and continued to borrow. The housing market continued to chug along. There was no adjustment factor. The household sector didn't retrench. And so it got more and more leverage. And when you look at household debt levels, and in Canada, in aggregate relative to incomes, it's about 50 percentage points higher than it was at the U.S. at its peak. So the U.S. is more resilient to that higher interest rate structure now, and it continues to be able to hum along. But wherever you've got those debt pockets, Canada being one of those places, that's where you feel the pinch from the higher interest rates.
Phillip, it sounds like you believe what Canada needs is a 2008 U.S. type correction to housing prices.
Well, nobody wants to go through that adjustment, unfortunately, right? I mean, that's the problem, is because it is painful on wealth of existing homeowners. It does bring down your affordability, but in a painful fashion. It's very difficult on the banks, as they try to adjust for it, and you end up with financial system strains. So it's not a great outcome. It's a likely outcome, is what it is. And because the area or the window for growing into this more gradually was really last decade by preventing the housing and debt levels from going up, using other types of policy tools to prevent that. The window or is narrowed in. Right now we're dealing with an interest rate shock, and we're trying to get around it. If we get into the next global recession where unemployment rises, including in Canada, well, then that's a lethal combination. So it's a likely outcome. It's not one that anyone wishes for, but it's a likely outcome.
Is there any policy that the Canadian government could do? Is there any policy moves they could make to provide for a soft landing and not a hard landing?
Yeah, I mean, I would be an advocate of the Bank of Canada stop focusing on inflation, do cut rates. But in doing so, you provide the reduced interest rate structure for people who live in their houses, right? And so homeowners, to refinance them. What's been a real problem in the Canadian market is that low interest rate structure has been done in investment demand. The reason why we have unaffordable homes and a seemingly lack of supply is 30% of the market's owned by investors. So you don't want to continue to subsidize that with lower interest rates. So you just end up exacerbating the problem. But certainly to keep homeowners afloat, help the affordability, try to push out or squeeze out some of those investors over time, but subsidize the people who are living in their homes that do own it, because otherwise you do have a crisis on your way, and it comes back into consumption and all those kind of things. So there's some tools, but the problem is the policy mix now becomes more delicate and more nuanced, if you will, using a variety of tools at different points. It's not blunt instruments anymore, because the window for that was last decade, not this decade.
Phillip, I hope people are listening to you. You seem to know what you're talking about, and I really hope some policymakers are listening. Thanks so much for your time this morning.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
That's Phillip Colmar, global strategist at MRB Partners.